Australian Institute of Polish Affairs, AIPA, as well as friends of AIPA. Today's meeting and today's lecture is extremely important, both because of the guest and topic. The guest is Professor Stanislaw Obirek, a cultural anthropologist and professor at Warsaw University. He teaches in the American Studies Center, was visiting professor in numerous British and American universities, and among other institutions, he was also a visitor to Australia as a guest of AIPA. Stanislaw Obirek is extremely well known in Poland, mostly as a commentator and analyst of the Polish Catholic Church, a very powerful institution which plays a very important role also in not only cultural but also political life. His last book, one of the few dozen books and hundreds of publications, is Gomora. The book is about the influence of money and power in the Catholic Church, and today's lecture will be around this topic, because the reason for which Gomora is a bestseller in Poland is that it asks a most serious question: can Polish Catholic Church be saved or reformed? So may I invite Professor Stanislaw Obirek. The format will be as normal. We'll have about 45 minutes lecture, and then Professor Obirek agreed to answer few questions. So please direct questions directly to him, but you have to wave your hand or signal your willingness to ask the question. So without any further delay, may I invite Professor Obirek.
Thank you very much, Gosia and Janek, that you made this event possible. I have to add that when you invited me to deliver this lecture, I was overwhelmed with nostalgic memories. 20 years ago exactly, I have a tour thanks to Professor Ehrenkreuz in the time and many of you who are attending this event. I remember this 3 weeks in Australia as the most moving, perhaps, in my life as a Jesuit in the time. And I share this memory in my heart and mind. And as you may remember, the focus on our meetings, which were informal, not very structured, were focused on Jewish-Christian relations. This is one of the reasons why I decided to return to the topic also in my lecture today, but from different perspective. I think that in the last 20 years, so many books were published, so many discussions were really changed our perception of the role of the Church, of the Catholic Church in the Holocaust also, that we need to reflect upon this. The next important issue, I think, which are shaping our religious, political imaginations is the place of religion in public space, particularly in a pluralistic democracy. You are at home with this topic in Australia, and I remember very fondly a meeting which you organized with Professor Zubrzycki, late Professor Zubrzycki, who is founding father of pluralistic way to deal with religion in public space, and we have still ahead this process of learning, and it will be the second and the last part of my presentation. I am a very old-fashioned, unfortunately, so I don't use all these wonderful skills which my students are using in their presentation. I have a very traditional paper for my presentation, so sorry for this, not to be entertaining, but boring, but nevertheless, I think sometimes it's good to return to this old style of presenting things in a very theoretical frame, but I hope it will be not too theoretical, with some practical implications. So the title, Can We Save the Catholic Church? With question mark. I took this title from one of the last by Hans Küng, who passed away this year, one of the greatest, I think, Catholic theologian of the 21st century. The book was published 10 years ago in German, but is now available also as English translation. And for Küng, as a theologian, as a Catholic theologian, the most important questions was related to how the Catholic Church is implementing or not the most important documents of the Vatican II, and why actually this institution grown more conservative, and why the post-conciliar popes refused to open dialogues on many issues like celibacy of priests, the role of women in the priesthood, homosexuality, or the use of contraception, even to prevent AIDS. To put it shortly and clearly, the papacy has lost touch with reality. Now, amid widespread delusion over child abuse, the future of the Catholicism is in crisis. Also in Poland, as in in Australia, you feel it, you faced it. Of course, Pope Francis seems sincere in his wish for a more compassionate, more open, more dialogical church. The time is ripe for reform. Now we are in the process of synod and synodal reform of the church. And here King calls for a complete renewal of the church. But I think that even more important, and this is why King is for me only departure point, because I think that the more important than the inner reform of the church is the necessity to change the attitude of Catholics toward others, other religions, ethnic groups, etc. For this reason, I will focus my attention, as I mentioned, on growing Catholic anti-Semitism and problems of many Catholics with democracy. So diagnosis, it will be a kind of diagnosis. And my first point, the failure of the Catholic Church in dealing with anti-Semitism. In order to heal or to overcome the present crisis of the Catholic Church, we need a good diagnosis of its illness. Of course, we have many such diagnoses. Some were already well described in many good books. What I am going to offer is a kind of overview of the most silent problems which I see today in the Catholic Church. At the end of the 50s, and this will be, I'm sorry, but I think that the history is not so well known. And in order to understand why actually, after 50 years of Nostra Aetate, the founding document, redefining, it was really a Copernican revolution in the teaching of the church. We still have Catholic theologians, the majority of Catholics, having problem with anti-Semitism in terms embracing actually anti-Semitism as their worldview. So a short, really brief overview of the historical development. So Vatican II, and particularly Pope John XXIII. After more than 15 centuries, from 413 to 1965, of confrontation with other cultures and religions, the Catholic Church started a new chapter of dialogue and openness, particularly two documents accepted by the participants of Second Vatican Council 1962-65, Nostra Aetate, Our Age, and Dignitatis Humanae, on human dignity, but better, I think, should be translated on religious freedom, were decisive in this process. In fact, both commenced a very vivid theological debate of Catholic theologians with representatives of other religions and with secular culture also. And it was not the case before. The church in this 15th century long tradition was actually convinced to possess the truth and to willing to share, to spread this truth, not willing to learn from others, stigmatizing others as pagans, as schismatics, as heretics, etc. So the beginning was very promising. Unfortunately, after a few years of spiritual and theological enthusiasm of some theologians, particularly in Western Hemisphere and in Latin America, the so-called post-conciliar popes, Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI, were more preoccupied with the restoration of traditional, means exactly post-Constantine Catholicism, than with the continuation of aggiornamento of Catholicism to the modern world. The ambivalent message to the global church, on the one hand, declaration of openness and dialogical attitude, and on the other hand, the closing of the theological debate on the most relevant issues for the reform of the church, brought as a result a confrontation of Catholics with modernity and postmodernity. The liberal theologians were marginalized and deprived academic position in Catholic institutions. That started with Hans King, whom I mentioned. He already in 1979 was deprived of missio canonica, the possibility to teach in the name of the church. So they were all marginalized or silenced. The liberal Catholic theologians underlined the role of the bishops and the local churches, sexual ethics, contraception and abortion, the possibility of ordination of women and celibacy are the most important issue in the Catholic Church. But exactly these issues were forbidden to be discussed. The same should be said about the ecumenical movement and interreligious dialogue which were strictly controlled by the Roman Curia. One of the most surprising first century is a growing anti-Semitism in countries where Catholics constitute the majority of the society. It is not easy to explain this tendency in the light of the declaration Nostra accepted, as I mentioned, by Catholic Church already in 1965. How is it possible to understand this disturbing trend? The majority of theological studies of Jewish and Catholic theologians are focused on the analysis of the common biblical sources and on the process of the separation of the two respective religious traditions in the first centuries after the death of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem temple. There is no doubt that World War II and the destruction of European Jews had a great impact on these studies. A new perspective was gained thanks to the Jewish response to the Catholic Declaration. Exactly when I was 20 years ago in Australia, it was issued an extremely important document signed by hundreds of rabbis, Jewish scholars, etc. Dabru Emet, speak the truth. And a few years ago, another document between Jerusalem and Rome, signed even by conservative rabbis, were issued. In both documents, one can observe an awareness of the profound changes in the Catholic Church, which were welcomed by the Jewish authors. In the light of the positive development of the doctrinal debate between the representative church and Jewish churches, it is hard to understand in 5 Roman Catholics still reject to have a Jewish name, and they are foundings of the recent value research. I'm not going into details, but in any way, we have this sharp contrast between the documents, declarations, etc., from the church and the persistence of this anti-Semitic attitudes of many Catholics. So now, in order to understand how come the Catholic Church came to this revolutionary change, we need to remember and to be grateful for few scholars, Jews and Christians, Jews and Catholics, Reform, Conservative. There are many names which I'm not going to mention because our time is limited, but few we need to remember. For those of you who are interested in the topic, I really warmly recommend to read a book by American historian John Connolly, who published a few years ago. And for me, it was open eyes experience to read it, From Enemy to Brother, The Revolution in Catholic Teaching on the Jews, 1933-1965. So exactly, Connolly is depicting in this book a panorama, a real landscape of efforts of hundreds of scholars, of activists who really changed approach of Catholics toward Jews and Judaism. And one important person, and I am just mentioning him, but believe me, without him, all revolution will be impossible, is a French historian, Isaac Gilles Isaac, and his book, Jesus and Israel. And another book, The Teaching of Contempt. Why Isaac's books are so important? Because he wrote those books during the Second World War in France. He, as many Jews, secularized Jews in France and Western Europe, discovered, so to say, the Jewishness thanks to Nazi, because they were persecuted. And he survived, but unfortunately not his family. And he was trying to understand how come in the heart of Christian Europe, this anti-Semitism happened. Why so many Christians actually willingly took part on the extermination of European Jews. Okay, he not only wrote a book, but also initiated a mutual debate with Jews and Christians. There are many initiatives in which he took part. I'm not going into the details, but believe me that thanks to him and his engagement with hierarchs, he met Pius XII. He met John XXIII, and he was able to convince, particularly Pope XXIII, that Christian or Catholic Church should and must change liturgical perpetuating of contempt toward Jews and Judaism. I have in mind, of course, the Wielki Piątek, the during Friday when the church was praying for perverted Jews. And this Jewish important scholar. But they are, thanks God, some Catholic scholars who in 60s, 70s published path-breaking books like John Pawlikowski, Dominican sister Rose Tering, and so on and so on. They are a list of different people who not only were involved in discussion, but were scandalized with its own tradition of teaching of contempt, of perpetuating contempt, etc. But apart of this direct involvement in Jewish-Christian dialogue, what is important, important were historical studies, study of the New Testament. And again, when I compare my awareness, my knowledge about Christian tradition, I was not aware, for example, that New Testament is so heavily loaded with anti-Jewish legacy. And it was, we know this thanks to scholars like Dominique Crossan, like Bart Ehrman, and again, the studies are available, and that we should change, not reject New Testament, but to read it critically. We need to apply to this foundational text an approach of hermeneutic of suspicion. What is behind? It was really so, or it is a kind of historical policy behind why the Jews were blamed by death of Jesus, although we know that actually the Romans condemned him, and so on and so on. So I will just quote Bart Ehrman, who is very well known in United States, has a special web page and the special program of spreading this new knowledge about New Testament. But some of his books are also translated into Polish, and I will read a quotation which is extremely, for me, important in order to understand why this anti-Jewish attitudes are so deeply rooted in minds of so many Christians, so many Catholics. So the book which I have in mind is quoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And in this book is quotation. One of the ironies, writes Ehrman, of early Christianity is that Jesus himself was a Jew who worshipped the Jewish God, kept Jewish customs, interpreted Jewish law, and acquired Jewish disciples who accepted him as the Jewish Messiah. Yet, within just a few decades of his death, Jesus' followers had formed a religion that stood all against Judaism. And this, I think, explains a little bit why it is so difficult to fight anti-Semitism, to demonstrate that it's completely false and is not based on what Jesus actually wanted from his disciples. I will skip some other bibliographical notes, but just I will conclude this first part with appeal. Perhaps it could be an interesting answer and questions and answer session when we will ask ourselves how far this new knowledge is spread between contemporary Catholics, not only in Poland, but perhaps in Australia, in globally. I think this is the problem. How to translate what the Vatican in 50 years ago decided in the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate, after we have this extremely exciting and encouraging development of mutual dialogical exchange of ideas between Jews and Christians, but why we have a problem to translate it into daily life. Just to come back to my experience in Australia, how come that we have so important, I think, and really mutually enriching exchange of ideas between Jews and Christians, but outside of the Catholic Church. Why in Melbourne I couldn't face the same topic with my Jesuit brothers, who were refusing even an idea to speak about Jewish-Christian dialogue. I will not mention names, but I know that they still consider avoiding any dialogue between Jews and Christians as a way to preserve their Catholic identity and orthodoxy. We have the same here, with more reason, so to say, because in Poland we have anti-Semitism, but without Jews, as you know. Okay, so I think this is enough for my first part, giving also the time. I have a look on the time table, and I pass to the next part of my presentation, namely the Catholic Church and modern and liberal democracies. And I have to say, I feel more at home in this topic, because as Jan said at the beginning of his kind presentation, I'm teaching currently at Warsaw University at the American Studies Center. And of course, I cannot focus my attention in lectures and seminars on theology, because the students have in mind other topics. So I try to connect religion with the politics, with culture, with media, with pop culture even. So believe me, this is my home, so to say, in terms of trying to transmit to my student my passion that Catholicism is possible, not only this which they know from theology, which is a kind of experience for most of them. And the book which Jan also mentioned, Gomora, actually written together with the attorney Arthur Novak, is a kind of statement in the present deplorable state of relationship between the church and state in Poland. So this is why I will avoid Poland in the second part, because hardly you can find a creative, imaginative proposals to define actual relationship between religion and politics, because what we have is, I will be harsh now, but I think with some reasons, what we have in Poland is a kind of Iranization of religion, that religion is behind the political choices of the current government. Like Khomeini successors in Iran, who defined the policy of Iran in religious terms, we have very similar situation in Poland. It sounds too radical, but if you analyze carefully what is going on in this country, I think without this fundamentalistic, politicized Catholicism, we will be in different point of our building democracy in Poland. Okay, so now briefly the second part. At the beginning, I would ask the question, how and if at all, the Catholic Church is compatible with modern and liberal democracies? The answer to this question is important and even vital for the future of this institution. On the one hand, the theology of John Courtney Murray was decisive in the elaboration of the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae on religious freedom, encouraged Catholics to accept liberal democracies and religious pluralism. But on the other hand, in many countries, the Catholic Church is unwilling to accept democratic rules. For example, in Poland, as I mentioned, after the political changes in 1989. Nevertheless, the legacy of this Jesuit Murray is vividly developed in Georgetown, for example, in Georgetown University in Washington. And almost all of his writings are available online, and some are reprinted many times. And of course, if some of Catholics would like to study how it is possible and necessary to be only one of many voices in the modern debate, we have Dignitatis Humanae, we have Murray, but the problem is that, as in the case of this important open eye studies on Jewish-Christian relations, they are completely ignored or unknown. The same, unfortunately, should be said about Murray's contribution. So, to understand better the cultural and theological background of these attitudes of the many Catholics, and perhaps to help them to overcome them, it is good to introduce the concept of post-secularism as a kind of hermeneutical key for the present pluralistic character of contemporary society. So perhaps for some of you, post-secularism is one of a new fashionable term, but for me is a key to be optimist, a key to believe that mutual respect between religious and secular people is not a utopian project, but is a daily life reality. So what I'm going to say in the next 10 minutes or so is to enumerate many examples of how post-secularism is the vivid reality for many leading Catholics and many leading secular thinkers. On the right, on the side of Catholics, I have in mind Josef Ratzinger, for example, who in 2004 have a very important exchange of ideas in Munich with Jürgen Habermas. I have in mind Michel Dion, Irish sociologist of religion, who is now based in the United States, who wrote exactly a book on post-secular Catholicism, focused on legacy of Pope Francis. So it's not, believe me, it's not a theory, it's not a pure speculation, but it's something which I observe as a cultural anthropologist, not as a theologian, because very few theologians are interested in this kind of reflection, but for me, it is a promising sign that something is, that the creation, so to say, of new living together is possible. But as a good Catholic patriot, I will start, and Polish patriot, I will start with Polish examples, because I think not everyone is aware of using post-secular methodology or procedures in dealing with modernity, but actually is practicing this. And one of them is Leszek Kołakowski. in Poland, or as I mentioned, Habermas, Charles Taylor, political scientists, sociologists, Zygmunt Bauman, Ulrich Beck, etc. So it will be too long to go went into details, but I will summarize these efforts to combine living together religious and secular people with Thomas Kuhn's idea of changing of paradigm. So you remember this important book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Kuhn stated to be accepted as a paradigm, a theory must seem better than its competitor. So I think that really we have in post-secularism a solution which is better from what was till now. What was till now, that the both camps, so to say, or that both groups were trying to convince the opponents that they are wrong, that they are stupid, or they don't understand. And here we have a mutual listening to one another. And I think this is what we can call the change of paradigm. And let me continue it perhaps with Taylor. It seems to me that the criticism of the way in which the concept of religion and probably also the concept of God was used and abused in Western theology is not only justified, but also finds confirmation in books dealing with religion without God. In addition, the recent analysis of the secularization process has drawn attention to the phenomenon of essentialization of Christianity, which in effect provoked Ivan Illich to introduce the concept of corruption of Christianity. It's a very strong term formulated actually by a very important and engaged Catholic thinker, namely what Illich had in mind, the betrayal of its original legacy. And this is quoted by Charles Taylor, again, a Catholic, Canadian Catholic thinker, in his acclaimed book, Secular Age, published in 2007. In this context, it is good to remember the proposal of Wilfred Cantwell Smith to reject the traditional concept of religion. Thanks to his radical position, Smith helps to overcome the negative heritage of the concept of religion, because it is a theoretical construction which does not correspond to the fullness and richness of religious experience. Theology, in fact, as an intellectual reflection on religious reality, is a part of this construction and has to be abandoned as well. And I am quoting Smith. Theology is part of the traditions, is part of this word. Faith lies beyond theology, in the hearts of men. Truth lies beyond faith, in the heart of God, end of quotation. The conclusion to which Smith arrived is his appeal to formulate also the traditional names of word religion. Again on quotation, on the verbal plane, as seriously suggest that terms such as Christianity, Buddhism, and the like must be dropped as clearly untenable once challenged. Smith, why him? He was a founder of an important influential school at Harvard University. Today, I think many scholars in the United States actually developed this idea that we have to problematize what was received from the tradition. Is not indifferent. Our terms in theology, if you consider theology as a science, because many people have doubts about this, I think that is part of humanistic reflection, theology as such. But because of critical hermeneutical approach, which contextualized also Catholic tradition, we can enter in mutual fruitful dialogue with other religions, but we cannot pretend that we are right, that our narrative is the obligatory one. And only when we have this humble attitude to our own tradition, we can really have a fruitful exchange and peaceful living together. In this context, it is possible not only to discuss concrete religious tradition, but also to negotiate their quality, and this is important. And it is exactly what post-secularism is suggesting. As an example of this negotiation, I see an interesting proposal elaborated by German sociologist Ulrich Beck in his last book, by the way, A God of One's Own, which is directed to secular and to religious people as well, including Christians. According to Beck's vision, the crucial criterion for the believer is not an external doctrinal elaborated in the history of Christianity, but a personal and individual decision to choose one's God. Therefore, in his view, I quote, Christianity may have undergone a conversion from an intolerant, persecuted with fire and sword to the limited form of tolerance. As you see, the program is very modest and limited, but I think the change is radical. Instead of preaching a crusade, you change your attitude. You try to listen. You try to understand the world around you. It seems to me that exactly this limited form of tolerance is at stake when we discuss the concept of religion and its impact on human history. The awareness of mutual correlation between religion and culture on the one hand, and dependence of both on life experience on the other hand, could be a good departure point for the process of conversion of all participants in public debate. I believe that stronger awareness of the limitations of respective worldviews as an essential element in what therefore has been known as religion would be helpful not only in the accurate understanding of that concept, but also will create the possibility to enter into a creative dialogue between representatives of the secular and religious worldviews. And now this good example, you are still there. Could I, perhaps another 5 minutes will be fine? Okay, thank you for noting your patience. So my last really part of my presentation is, I think, a good illustration of what I'm going to share with you, this optimism. So a good example of the practical consequences of the acceptance of post-secular worldview is the meeting between Jürgen Habermas and Josef Ratzinger, as I mentioned, in 2004 in Munich. So Ratzinger, Rottweiler of Wojtyła, as you remember, the prefect of, because it's important who he was 1 year before becoming a pope. But first of all, he was this embodiment of Torquemada of modern times, right? And listen how differently he is acting when faced with reasonable proposal of someone who is really preoccupied how we can live together. So we are in Germany, in the very secular world, and we have on the one hand a leader of this secular discourse, Habermas and Ratzinger. And what happened? It's published, by the way, this conversation between both, with the introduction of the director of the Catholic Academy in Munich, and it's available in many languages, but not in Polish. In Polish, only text of Habermas is available in collection of essays of him, and of Ratzinger, Tygodnik Powszechny, once published. But as far as I remember, this debate was never discussed publicly in Poland, which is for me significant. So it was an academic exchange of two German intellectuals who have never met before, and whose widely recognized academic achievements are related to completely different fields. Habermas is a well-known philosopher not interested in religion, and Ratzinger is a very influential Catholic theologian known for his critical attitude towards modern culture. In this debate, the term post-secularism was introduced by Habermas to create a dialogical space for secular and religious positions. In his response, Ratzinger not only accepted the proposed term, but saw in post-secularism a chance to overcome the existing impasse between religious and secular worldviews, and underlined the positive contribution of critical thinking for the purification of religious fanatism. This is Ratzinger. To illustrate this process of mutual learning, I would like to quote just two statements in which they both recognized the necessity to hear one another. Habermas said that, I quote, "In the post-secular society, there is an increasing consensus that certain phases of the modernization of the public consciousness involved the assimilation and the reflexive transformation of both religious and secular mentalities. If both sides agree to understand the secularization of the society as a complementary process, then they will also have cognitive reasons to take seriously each other's contributions to controversial subjects in the public debate." Habermas, complex thought, but I think behind this, let us talk, speak to one another. Don't shout to one another. Ratzinger, in his answer, accepted Habermas' suggestion by saying, I quote, "With regard to the practical consequences, I am in broad agreement with Jürgen Habermas' remarks about post-secular society, about the willingness to learn from each other, and about self-limitation on both sides." You see, is a declaration of the chief of the modern Inquisition. He declared this good to limit my appetite for decide what is good or what is wrong. This is a learning process from both sides. Okay, I think that Beck, I mentioned him already. Perhaps I will finish with very dear note to me, namely I will quote Zygmunt Bauman. I have to confess that Bauman, for me, in the last years, we started our friendship, I think, in late 90s. And when I was editing as a Jesuit a journal, Spiritual Life, and Bauman contributed to this periodical. And after we published together 2 books, and I consider him as a mentor, as a master of the intellectual honesty and flexibility, that you are able not only to see how reality is complex, but also you are including in your reflection on the reality the new elements which were not present before. What I have in mind, and I think that Bauman will agree with me, that he became an post-secularist without using this word. All his life, as you know, he never abandoned his secular, atheistic approach toward reality, his leftist approach toward reality, his sensibility toward sufferings of this world. And as Habermas, he was actually unwilling to deal with religion. And I have to say that I forced him in a way to say, no, Zygmunt, no, tell me, what do you think about religion? So I think his last book, Retrotopia, is a kind of recognizing that religion is relevant, as Habermas did. And from his editor, a publisher in Italy, I know that he was planning to publish a book of conversation between Zygmunt Bauman and Pope Francis. Unfortunately, Zygmunt passed away before this came through, but they met. They met in Assisi, 2016. And I think a reflex of this meeting could be found in this last book. So really last few minutes. So my final example for post-secular context is the book by Zygmunt Bauman, Retrotopia, which could be seen as his intellectual legacy. In the final chapter entitled Epilogue, Looking Forward for a Change, he made an enthusiastic reference to Pope Francis' texts and gestures, specifying several problems which humanity must cope with in the present moment of history. Bauman finds only one person who can supply an adequate answer. I quote, "I found in Pope Francis currently the person among public figures of considerable great planet-wide authority who is bold and determined enough to raise and tackle these sorts of questions." End of quotation. I'm finishing in a few seconds. Bauman quotes extensively the speech given by Pope Francis on the 6th of May 2016, when he received the European Child Mind Prize. For Bauman, the Pope's speech is inspiring because he sees in it a concrete suggestion to resolve some problems of our world. For Bauman, I quote, "The intention behind Pope Francis' message is to bring the fate of peaceful cohabitation, solidarity, and collaborations of humans from the fuzzy and obscure realm of high politics." And for this reason, Bauman concludes his book with a positive note. The chances of fruitful dialogue, as Pope Francis reminds us, depend on our reciprocal respect and assumed, granted, and mutually recognized status equality. The post-secular understanding of religious and secular mutuality is exactly about this. Thank you for your patience. I will conclude here, and I pass to Jan.
Thank you very much, Staszek. And before I open the floor for discussion, may I greet our guest tonight, Mrs. Geraldine Doug. Geraldine, you are most welcome here. Geraldine Doug is Australian journalist, very prominent, radio and TV presenter, and she has been host of Radio National Life Matters, programs about faith, religion, spirituality, which is extremely popular in Australia. Now I'm opening the list of participants and waiting for those who would like to ask questions or make a short comment to signal it. You can ask questions directly by introducing yourself. So you're most welcome. Everyone is most welcome to ask questions.
Just a short comment to congratulations on displaying the rainbow flag. Thank you very much. This behind a very deep purpose, because as you may know, in Poland, the Catholic Church is one of the most homophobic institutions, and because most of my lectures are online, usually people are surprised that I have this flag, although I'm not of LGBT community, and usually I explain that actually this is the most dear biblical symbol of covenant between God and humanity. And usually it starts a nice a conversation about how far from biblical notions are Polish hierarchs who are spreading these nasty comments on rainbow flag and so on and so on. So just to who made this, Bogdan made this comment. Thank you.
Staszku, dziękuję bardzo. Oh, sorry. Many thanks for this most enlightening presentation. I appreciate very much for your point of view, which is from above. But I have perhaps a question to you. Namely, at the very beginning, you have mentioned those very practical reasons why Catholics have problems with Catholic faith in general. You have mentioned that celibate, role of women, contraception are very sort of a stumbling blocks in fully accepting Catholic teaching. I would add to this list one, to me, very important reason why people might not be happy in the Catholic Church. Namely, the stand of Church regarding divorce. I am referring to my two friends, women friends. Both of them are mothers of few children, abandoned by their husband. They are very, very committed Catholics, and although they are quite attractive women, they do not want to enter into another relations with men. And to me, this is really something which is supposed to be considered as a stumbling block in fully acceptance of Church. So that's basically, please maybe to the list of problems, add this problem with divorce. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dziękuję, Marku. I have also fondly memories to spend lovely moments with you and your wife 20 years ago. So it's occasion to thank you for your hospitality then. And coming back, you're right. Divorce is one of the most painful, I would say, aspect of the current moral rigidity of Catholic Church. And what is perhaps a very small element of optimism, that actually Pope Francis opened a discussion on it. The problem is not directly related to divorce as such, but to a possibility to receive communion for remarried couples. And in Germany, it is already accepted practice that people who, and you mentioned example of your friends, and I think this is a very spread phenomenon, that people without any thought are facing this life reality, that they are living together with children, and perhaps they have another marriage, and the church consider as a concubinate, as illegal, as not Christian, as not Catholic. But this is the point which is discussed. We have many statements by Pope who is closer to daily life experience of people. He never rejected communion to someone who wanted to get communion, although he knew that they are divorced couple and remarried couple. So I think this is exactly the moment, the point where Catholic doctrine is changing. And I have to add also to my answer that we know from the history of Catholic Church that this institution never changed voluntarily. This institution must be forced to change. So when Catholics, and this is the German slogan, "Wir sind die Kirche," we are the church, not the hierarchs, not the priests, not even the Pope, but we believers, we know that God loves us. We know that He came to this world to save us in our miserable condition. And divorce is part of this sometimes difficult situation. So more and more pastors, bishops are accepting this. And I hope that in few years, although I don't consider myself as a practicing Catholic, I don't need the institution for my worldview, for my life. I don't need spiritual support for institution. I follow Ulrich Beck advice, and I have my own God, and I don't need a priest who will tell me what is good and what is wrong. And I think more and more Catholics are following this consciousness as the last decision maker instance, not what priests are saying. So if I could have an advice for your friends, it will be good not to listen so much to what the priests are saying, but to listen to their respective conscience.
Thank you, Staszek. The only problem is that they wanted to remarry, and of course find a priest who will officiate this will be not easy. Simply, officially remarriage is still not available for in situation like that.
Could I be ironic?
Yes.
Everything, Marek, everything is possible. It's a question of money. If you pay enough, you will see that the bishop, local bishop, will decide, well,
Right. You're right.
is not a divorce, because the Catholic Church don't know. But me, as a former Jesuit, I know that with law you can do everything. You can know it. You can name it annulment. You declare that the previous marriage was non-valid.
Yeah.
Just pay enough. I'm sorry for being so sardonic, but this is the problem, that the church is not an organization which are paying attention to goodness of people, but for looking for her own interest, and this is the problem.
Thank you.
May I? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Professor Obirek, I have been following your work, and am going to read Gomora soon, I hope. You do refer in some of your interviews to the famous Frederick Martel's book, In the Closet of the Vatican. I have a very specific question. Martel writes about Maciel de Golado in this book. He writes about him at length, and he writes about his relationship with, or alleged relationship with John Paul II, and the fact that this most atrocious individual has amassed incredible wealth, and that he was funding a lot of activities of the Vatican at the time. And apparently his organization has been recently mentioned in the so-called Pandora Papers. My question is, having read that this organization founded the Vatican, and as a result allowed John Paul II to allegedly fund Solidarity, is this knowledge common in Poland? Is this damaging in any way the image of John Paul II in the Polish Catholic society? Is it something that anyone bothers with? It's quite extraordinary, and I have a feeling that I would like to know a bit more about it. Thank you.
Excellent question. I just this is even better book than Martel's The Closet in the Vatican. This is a Polish version of Śluby Milczenia, the Votes of Silence. This is entirely dedicated. It's published the first, now is the second Polish edition, but it was published, I think, for the first time in 2004. So before John Paul II passed away, and I know the author, Jason Berry, is one of the most prominent American journalists who wrote extensively on covering up well, it was not only pedophilia, it was corruption, it was not really a very negative, dark figure in the Church of Mexico. But de Golado is was a Mexican, founded a Legionari di Cristo, the organization which is still now extremely influential. And Frederick Martel mentioned him only to demonstrate how he was close related to John Paul II. Although it was clear that his abuses were well known. The journalists were trying to write about. They wanted to contact Ratzinger in the time. So it's a very complex question, and is for those who are willing to be informed, is known in Poland, because Martel's book is translated into Polish, Jason's book is translated into Polish, many articles. Modestly, I can say I wrote several times about, in Gazeta Wyborcza, for example, in public debate, but I was attacked after. There are many things related together, so it's not easy to answer yes and no. But for example, a McCarrick report published last November 2020, where it was clearly demonstrated. This report was written and made because the Vatican wanted it. And the relationship between McCarrick and Dziwisz and John Paul II was obvious. But we have the similar case of corruption, covering up, and pedophilia. So the complex of this covering up by John Paul II, Degolado, McCarrick, we have also Bernard Law, Cardinal from Boston, and you remember Spotlight, Boston Globe report, and after 2015, the film based on these reports of journalists in Boston Globe. So the problem is, to answer your question, very important but very complex one. In Poland, we have to do with mythologization of the memory of John Paul II. As with myths, it's very hard to discuss. The mythologization is one from humanities. We know how hardly, well, let us take less complex problem, how difficult it was for communists to accept Khrushchev's report on crimes of Stalin. Many were crying, were not believing, because it was cult of personality. The Stalin was the most adored figure for them. And it took years to change it. And we are on the beginning of this process of demythologization. With Artur Nowak, with whom I wrote Gomora, and we started our friendship 2 years ago with writing together The Narrow Path, Why We Abandoned the Church. We are planning to write a book on John Paul II also, which is correlated to the film is in process by brothers Sekielscy, who made 2 films, very important films of pedophilia in Catholic Church. But we are still considered as nest beschmutzer, so to say, as those who are telling bad about their own institution, about their own country. So just today, a very right-wing news weekly magazine, Politice, wrote extensively on Gomora, and in an interview which we gave based on this book, that we are horrible, we are attacking church, we are full of hatred toward the church, we are actually, and so on. So the debate is hot. They are making us actually a good, they are promoting our book. So I'm taking this with smile. I'm not horrified by these attacks, but the process is long, but I am optimist. We need to take our future in our hands. And part of this responsibility is to deconstruct myth creating around us And the one myth is this, that Catholic Church was fighting for democracy, which is not true. As you know, 10% of Catholic clergy collaborated with secret services, and the myth of John Paul II as someone who was infallible in all his activities. He was a great personality. His contribution into Jewish-Christian dialogue is without discussion. His involvement in changing political system in East Bloc is out of discussion, but he badly managed his own institution. And this is the problem. We try to convey this message to our readers, to audience, and I'm grateful that I can share this also with you.
Thank you very much, Staszko. Unfortunately, we have to finish our meeting. So may I open the field for one more last question? If not, may I take a privilege of the chair and ask your comment on the phenomenon which is finally noticed by the Polish Catholic hierarchy, the fact that the young people in Poland leave Catholic Church in droves. The research conducted by Pew Research Center shows that young people are abandoning both church and to a lesser extent Catholic faith. It's based on the question, the research question, which asks of the role of the faith and the church in everyday life, people, whether it's important or less important. Poland is #1 country in the proportion of young people living both the church and the faith, but to a lesser extent the faith. Old people stick to the church, and because Poland is aging society, it creates an impression that it is a country or society in which the church and Catholicism play still dominant role. I don't think it's the case. So could you comment as a sort of answer to your question, can the Catholic Church be saved?
Dziękuję, Janku. Thank you. This is the very, very important issue, actually. And since these results from Pew Research Center were published, it was a real wave of comments in Polish press also. And I had occasion also to comment this. And my impression is that, unfortunately, the Polish hierarchy is not online with post-secularism. They are still considering secularization as the most dangerous threat to their Christian Catholic identity. They don't welcome secularization as purification process, as a way to, or a chance to return to the sources. And they is almost a ridiculous comment by Jędraszewski, the Archbishop, who said that the young people will będą jeszcze żałować I wrócą do kościoła. Means that they will return to the church, because the offer of faith, of religious comfort which the church is offering, they will feel, as probably soon as possible. So yes, I would comment like this. We are, and it is the shortest comment which I can now think about. We are exactly in the moment where the Catholic Church in Ireland was 10 years ago. As you well know from sociological part, as a sociologist, you remember that Irish identity was almost exchangeable with Catholic identity. And you know what happened concerning divorce, marriage of the same sex couple, and so on. So all progressive regulations are now passed in Ireland with majority of support of Catholic Irish people. So I think we are exactly in the same moment, or if I can allow me another comparison with the late Brezhnev. Everybody knew that Russian Empire is collapsing, a part of apparatchiks and Brezhnev himself. So fortunately, we have in Vatican not Brezhnev, but Gorbachev. So let us hope that perestroika and glasnost will arrive to Catholicism. And my guess is that the present form of Catholicism, and this is the intuition of Magda Schroeder, which I share completely, is the cultural, religious, civilizational potential of religion is over. We have to look elsewhere. And the young people are doing this already. I don't think that the present hierarchy will change. We have them to go to the annihilation, because this is the destiny of people who don't understand the world in which they are living. It will be my comment to your comment.
Reformation is coming.
More than reformation. I think that reformation was only a first step. Now we are, and I quote Karl Rahner, we are returning to the first century of Christianity, when Christianity was really not existing. It was the Jewish sect, considered by bystanders, outsiders, and we have now invented our new identity, perhaps without priests. Remember, Jesus was fighting with the religious establishment, with priests, with Pharisees, with experts of theology. His movement was a new beginning. And now I think we are on the new beginning, and our conversation is contributing to it. I think thanks to technology, we can communicate without just to regulate some details, and we can communicate without problems. So global process is that we are going in different directions. Pity that clergy are not online with this, but is bad for them, not for us. We are on the right side.
Staszku, amen. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to all participants in our discussion. We will be announcing our next guest, which will be most probably Olga Tokarczuk in December. But before I say goodbye to everyone and Staszek, may I also mention, if I'm not wrong, correct me, Staszku, that you are not only a friend of the Australian Institute of Polish Affairs, but also a laureate of Polkul Foundation. And
you know better than me, yes, this is right. Yes, thank you again.
Which is the largest organization in Australia supporting those who fight for civil society and democracy in Poland. So thank you very much again. and thank you to everyone. And I would like in particular to thank Gosia for organizing our meeting, and we'll keep in touch with you and advertise the dates and topic of our future meeting.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful lecture. Yes.